Now, people say to me, well, how do you define, what a hotspot is? Can you define it? Well, a hotspot to me is, somebody sees a UFO, I know, over Dallas tonight. That doesn't mean Dallas is weird. Well, I live in Dallas, and Dallas is weird. But I mean, joking aside, if somebody just sees a UFO flying over Dallas, the phenomenon that they've seen is weird, but the place isn't. But if you imagine you've got one place where people see UFOs, Bigfoot, ghostly activity, Men in Black, a whole range of different stuff, all concentrated on one area, then arguably that makes the place itself weird. And the one that I don't focus on in the book, because it's been done to death, is Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where in the 1960s you had a whole range of strange stuff that was chronicled by John Keel in his book The Mothman Prophecy, which was turned into a movie about 10 years ago. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, just a normal everyday town until about 1965, when people began reporting this sort of glowing-eyed, winged, almost like a cross between a demon and a gargoyle type creature that became known as Mothman. And the name kind of sounds cartoonish, like Batman or Spider-Man. But the reports are sort of more like gothic and supernatural. It's like a shadowy, winged, wraith-like creature that would hide in the shadows and sort of have these penetrating, glowing red eyes, and people would almost see like the peripheral vision, if you like, sort of lurking in the darkness. And it became known as Mothman. Well, at the same time that people were seeing the Mothman, people who witnessed it started getting these visitations from the so-called Men in Black. People think of Men in Black, they think of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones in the movies, but the real Men in Black are sort of very different. They're nothing like sort of government people. They're described as almost like creepy, sort of skinny, totally white-faced ghouls is probably the best way to describe them. They look like something, like imagine a modern-day vampire, who wouldn't turn up in a cloak and dress like a waiter, in like some old horror film. They'd be like, imagine a vampire dressed in a modern-day suit and it's like an old 50s fedora-style gangster hat. That's how they turn up, and they're very menacing and creepy. So they were out in force at Point Pleasant. There was a lot of strange poltergeist activity in people's homes, people having alien encounters, UFO landings, and then it all suddenly came to a halt. But John Keel came to believe that Point Pleasant was what he termed a window area. That's to say that it was a place on the planet that seemed to be like a magnet for strange phenomena. And he came to believe there was a reason for this. He believed that there are certain spots on the Earth that are sort of like doorways and portals to other dimensions where paranormal or supernatural phenomena can come through. Best way to describe it, if you're driving in your car and you turn the radio on, you don't like the song, so you tune to another station, you tune to another, you tune to another, you tune to the fifth one, you find like a song you like, you leave that one on. Well, all those stations are all playing at the same time, but you can only be tuned into one at any given time. It's not like the others just don't suddenly exist or pop into existence when you retune. They're all there at the same time. And that's what Keel came to believe. That's like a simplistic description, but he believed that we sort of coexist in multi-dimensions, and things today like quantum physics are allowing for the existence of multi-dimensions, that if you knew how to sort of skip from one to the other, you could actually zip in and out of one reality and into the other. And that's what Keel came to believe was going on at Point Pleasant, that there was sort of like a rift in the sort of space-time area that allowed all this stuff to come through. So that's basically the theme of the book. It looks at sort of 25 hotspots around the world where a lot of strange stuff has happened. Now, we start with one that probably a lot of people can think of, Loch Ness, Scotland, which of course is sort of allegedly the home of sort of a creature that looks like that, sort of like a long-necked, long-tailed, thick-bodied, flippant animal that would become known as Nessie. Now, of course, people talk about the Loch Ness Monster as if, there's just one. There've been reports for at least more than 1,000 years, so if there are strange creatures in Loch Ness, there wouldn't just be a Loch Ness Monster swimming around for 1,000 years. It'd have to be like, a colony of them. And if there is, people say, well, what are they? Well, that is a picture or drawing of a creature known as a plesiosaur, which existed during the prehistoric era, the dinosaurs. Supposedly became extinct like 60-something million years ago. One of the theories is that because Loch Ness, before the last ice age, actually opened to the oceans, it wasn't landlocked like a large lake. Could some of these creatures have swum in, and then when the lake finally got landlocked, they couldn't get out, and they bred there and sort of acclimatised themselves to it? Well, it's not impossible, but the ocean's obviously seawater, salt water. Loch Ness is freshwater. Now there are some animals which, there's like for example saltwater and freshwater crocodiles, and some animals can actually adapt. A lot of animals can't adapt at all. You put a sea freshwater fish into the ocean, it'll kill it. It's just it's like if we're in the sea, you get a mouthful of salt water, you know what it tastes like. It's that kind of that situation. So other people wondered, could they be giant eels, something like that. I guess if you're on the shores of Loch Ness and you see like a 30-foot long giant eel with a body the size of an oil drum, you're probably not going to argue whether or not it's a monster. It might be a giant eel, but it's for all intents and purposes it's a monster, I guess. Other people have suggested things like giant salamanders, giant sturgeon, catfish, all sorts of things. But that wouldn't explain the neck. And that sort of led to another theory, the idea that these creatures are paranormal, that they flitter out of our reality, because although Loch Ness is a large body of water, it's like 22 miles long, a mile wide, and about 800 feet deep. Questions have been asked as to whether a creature like that, which typically grew to like 20 to 30 feet long, and of course, if they're living in Loch Ness, you would need a healthy, viably sized colony, so you'd have healthy reproduction, and is there enough fish in Loch Ness to feed like a colony of 30-foot long animals? That's going to require a lot of fish every day for every animal. And a lot of questions have been asked, maybe there isn't enough. Now there have been occasions where people have used sonar to scan the loch, kind of like the equivalent of radar in the sky. They've actually tracked the movements of one or two what seem to be large things under the water, but then they vanish in the same way that UFOs vanish off the radar screens. And this actually given rise, could these creatures be sort of passing through portals? And I don't think we can rule it out, because Loch Ness is legendary for a lot of other strange activity. Everybody thinks of the Loch Ness Monster, but back at the start of the 20th century, like 1908, 1909, one of the most famous occultists, Aleister Crowley, actually had a house on the shores of Loch Ness called Boleskine House, which in the 1970s was owned by Jimmy Page, the guitarist with Led Zeppelin. And around about 1910, 1912, Crowley is supposedly involved in all sorts of ancient rituals and rites to try and summon up demons out of Loch Ness. There's been a lot of UFO activity over the loch. People have reported seeing like huge black cats prowling the shore. Now, in Britain, there are no indigenous large big cats, like mountain lions or panthers or anything like that. But every year there are hundreds of reports of these sort of giant black cats roaming around, and many of them are seen at Loch Ness. There have been ghostly encounters at the loch, and so in other words, there's sort of 5 or 6 additional weird things going on all the time at Loch Ness beyond just Nessie. And I think the strangest of all involved a man named Ted Holliday, who was a Loch Ness Monster researcher, who came to believe that the creature was paranormal. And this sort of developed from the fact that on a number of occasions, he was obsessed with it. He wasn't just interested, grew to like a full-blown obsession. And he would spend weeks at the shore of the loch, waiting to see something to surface and photograph it. And on maybe 3 occasions out of 6 months, he thought he did see something. When he tried to photograph it, each occasion his camera would jam, or the picture would come out fogged. But on other occasions when he would test it, it wouldn't. It was almost like the phenomenon was taunting him, and then at the last moment preventing him from getting proof. And he came to believe that it wasn't a flesh and blood animal, or at least in the way we understand it. But in 1974, he had that kind of feeling that we all have on one occasion. When you think somebody's looking at you from behind, you turn around and somebody's staring right at you. You kind of get that feeling that somebody's doing that, and he had that. one particular occasion, 74, he turned round and he saw one of these classic Men in Black, these pale-faced guys, you know, in a black suit, of all, a lot less of all places, you know, on the shore, which sounds bizarre. And the very next year, the same spot, because he used to take his sort of summer holidays from work and, you know, just go out there every year. He had almost like a fatal heart attack on the very spot where the Man in Black was seen the year previously. So that was sort of ominous in itself. But it goes to demonstrate that, you know, that when we look into some of these places where they're famous for a paranormal phenomenon, they're actually sort of saturated with a whole range of additional paranormal phenomena as well. That's a place I actually grew up only about 10 miles from in central England called the Cannock Chase, which is a large area of forest. And that particular cemetery there, which is a huge cemetery, that's just a part of it in that photograph. And the forest goes on for about 27 miles past there, and all around it as well, I should say. That cemetery is called the German Cemetery, which kind of might sound a strange name for a cemetery in Britain. But the reason it's called the German Cemetery is because when the Second World War was going on and, you know, if German pilots were coming to Britain and bombing the country, you know, there were guys on the ground with, you know, sort of artillery weapons firing upwards to bring the planes down, or, you know, British aircraft would be up there trying to knock them out of the sky. And if the planes crashed on British soil and the pilots survived or they parachuted out, they'd be taken to prisoner of war camps in Britain. You know, in the same way that, you know, like for example the the Vietnam War, you know, when American troops were held prisoner in Vietnam, that kind of that same thing. And if any of the German soldiers or air crews or whatever died in Britain during the Second World War, they actually had a cemetery for them where they buried them all, and it's that one called the German Cemetery. But all around that cemetery for decades there have been sightings of strange activity. Interestingly enough, a lot of these sort of large black cats, which a number of researchers in the UK think have sort of paranormal origins as well. There have been reports also of sort of large glowing-eyed ghostly black dogs, which have become known as phantom black dogs in sort of paranormal research. And if any of you have ever read the Sherlock Holmes novel Hound of the Baskervilles or seen the movies, in the novel it's based around this legend of this sort of huge, like almost like pony-sized black dog with these fiery blazing red eyes that sort of prowls the countryside. It's sort of perceived as being like a Grim Reaper type creature. Well, Conan Doyle, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes novels, he actually based that story on existing stories of these phantom black dogs that have existed in British culture for centuries. And so he basically used the folklore and the mythology to write his novel. But the stories, you know, or the legends at least, have existed, as I said, for a very, very long time, and many of them are reported around this particular cemetery. In 2007, there was probably the strangest series of encounters of all, where people reported seeing this large wolf-like animal sort of prowling among the headstones. Now, there shouldn't be any wild wolves in Britain at all. Officially, the last wild wolf in the British Isles was killed in Scotland in the 1700s. That's, you know, how long the wolf hasn't existed in Britain. But there have always been rumours about pockets of wolves, you know, surviving, which probably, you know, there could be some truth to that. That's not anything paranormal, you know. Nature does have a way of surviving. But what was weird about this particular wolf is that people said that as when they saw it, or it saw them looking at it, it would rear up onto two hind legs, almost like, so it looked like a werewolf rather than a wolf. And again, you know, Britain has a lot of weird stories of werewolves, not from the perspective like the Hollywood thing of, you know, some guy bursting out of his clothes, you know, like a Hulk or something, and turning into this sort of 8-foot tall werewolf, but creatures that sort of look wolf-like, but that can stand on their hind legs. Now, you know, it sounds kind of bizarre, but if you look into Native American lore over here, they have similar reports of creatures like skinwalkers, where a person can adopt the guise of an animal and become sort of allegedly, you know, morphed into it. Other people suggest, you know, the paranormal angle, and a lot of these creatures are seen around like cemeteries, ancient bridges, ancient crossroads, which are all classic areas of paranormal activity throughout the world. You know, bridges, it's like the trolls in Scandinavia, A lot of Bigfoot reports in the US are reporting near bridges. You know, somebody's driving through the woods late at night and this hairy creature dashes across the road. It just happens to be on a stretch of bridge. You know, you have a lot of haunted bridges. With the Mothman stories at Point Pleasant in '67, it was all culminated in the collapse of the town's Silver Bridge, where dozens of people drowned when the cars fell into the Ohio River when the bridge collapsed. So for some reason, bridges, crossroads, cemeteries are all sort of interlinked with paranormal activity, and that's probably, in Britain at least, one of the sort of most paranormally soaked cemeteries you could find. And it's kind of funny, I grew up only like 10 miles from it, so it was like something I could check out pretty regularly. That's a place called Devil's Gate Dam in California, which is in Pasadena, so it's part of Los Angeles. And it's called Devil's Gate Dam. I don't think you can probably see it when I point it out, but that's supposedly like the horn of a devil. That's like its forehead, nose, eye, then you have the mouth, and then the chin there. It's sort of like, supposedly like a side profile of a demonic type face. Oh, excuse me. And so that's why it got locally it got this name, Devil's Gate Dam. But the dam itself, that particular area, that woodland, is again, it's sort of saturated by a lot of very, very strange stuff. You know, you imagine Los Angeles, Pasadena, sort of highly populated area. You know, how could there be somewhere mysterious like that? Well, when you actually get to the outskirts of Pasadena, where this is based, where I've taken that photograph, that's like at the bottom of a valley. And you probably have to walk downhill for like 10 minutes. So it's almost like a little hidden valley in Pasadena. And because of the way the wind blows and, you know, the ground, etc., when you're down there, it actually masks all the sound of the city. And it actually feels like, you know, you're in the middle of nowhere. And in reality, you're just, you know, you're very deep down in the middle of Pasadena. But it's heavily forested and wooded, and there are these hills and rivers. And, you know, it's kind of a spooky looking location. But in the 1930s, there was a man named Jack Parsons, who was an early rocket scientist, created there a company called the Aerojet Corporation. And just before the space shuttle fleet was retired just a year or two ago, the Aerojet Corporation was still making the solid rocket boosters for the massive fuel tank that the space shuttle would use to get it into space. So, you know, his company had, you know, he was a major player in rocketry back in the 1930s, and of course, you know, 70 years later, his company was still going. And he was also responsible for, not single-handedly, but with a group of them, creating NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. But he was also a noted occultist. He was a follower of Aleister Crowley, who just happened to have the house at Loch Ness. And he lived out at Pasadena, as I said, was a deep follower of Aleister Crowley. And before every rocket launch out there, he used to invoke the god Pan to try and ensure a successful flight. Now, at the time, all these rocket tests were being done on behalf of the military. The Army Air Force, it was combined at the time, called the US Army Air Force. And he had the top secret clearance with the military, and they just basically turned a blind eye to the fact that he also happened to be, you know, a practicing occultist and following Aleister Crowley. They were like, well, what he does in his spare time, you know, we don't really care, as long as he can build rockets for us. But he would, you know, sort of engage in all these rituals and rites, you know, stamping around at the rocket launch site and down on bending knees, you know, speaking in archaic languages. You'd have all these generals there sort of stood there, not too happy, but just get on with it, you know. And so, you know, he's an interesting character, but there's a lot of stories that because Parsons claimed to be opening doorways to bring in these ancient gods to ensure these sort of safe flights, there's theories, you know, did he open a door to something else, more negative, if you like? And what's interesting is that just behind those trees on the left-hand side, there's an old bridge. Again, you know, bridges coming into it again. That locally is known as Suicide Bridge. And the reason it's called that is because in the last century or so, I think the count now is like 130. In a century, like 130 people just thrown themselves off the bridge. You know, and when research has been done by the police, you know, the people didn't seem like typical suicide victims, you know. Weren't major problems going on in their lives for most of them. Obviously some there were, but they're just crossing the bridge and just threw themselves off. And the theory that some people have is that the entire area, thanks to sort of Parsons, has sort of it's adapted or adopted this sort of atmosphere of negativity and some sort of psychic backlash, if you like, which provokes a lot of strange stuff. And the other thing that's sort of very unsettling, not from a paranormal perspective, but if there is this sort of negative thing in the area, in the 1950s there was literally yards from where I took that photograph, there were a bunch of tragic killings of children by a man named Mac Ray Edwards, who was like a child serial killer. Just totally deranged. He hung himself in prison actually the day before Halloween in 1970. And it was, people have said, is it the area? Was it something to do with that? We don't know. That's kind of a more controversial, disturbing angle. But the fact that if all these people killed themselves there, Jack Parsons doing all these weird rites, and then you have this serial killer literally roaming this same area as well. A lot of people go there and they just feel this sense of something not being right about the area. It's like something they're not able to define properly. Kind of like sometimes people go to a house or a place and they just don't like it for some reason. And a lot of people get that out at Devil's Gate Dam. But what's even kind of stranger, you'd imagine that today NASA or the government would want to distance themselves from Parsons, but they actually don't. Every Halloween, and I'm really not making this up, but every Halloween, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, which is just at the other side of the dam, they have what's called Jack Parsons Day, where on Halloween they sort of pay homage to him, and they bring out these life-size mannequins, dummies, dressed as Parsons and all his colleagues, and they sort of toast him and to all the work he did. And they have this legend that the Jet Propulsion Lab actually stands for Jack Parsons Lives. This is sort of the people who are sort of sending people into space and rockets into space, and they're sort of paying homage to Jack Parsons, this occultist, and kind of saying, it sounds strange because it actually is strange, And even Parsons came to a violent end. He had a lab in his basement in his house in Pasadena in 1952. He actually blew himself up in the middle of an experiment. Literally blew himself to pieces. And there was a rumour that he was trying to conjure up a creature known as a homunculus. Homunculus is like if you look it up on the internet, it's basically described like a small, little human-like figure with magical powers, which some people describe as, like the little typical alien greys, because Parsons claimed to have opened a portal to bring flying saucers into our world in 1947 when the whole UFO wave first kicked off. He claimed that he opened the doorway and the saucers came through. So it's kind of weird that he would then be trying to conjure up this little figure in 52, and of course it all ended badly for him, and got killed, and that was the end of Parsons, which some people say, well, you dabble into all this sort of stuff, and then you pay the price for doing it, So but it's a very weird set of circumstances when you find out what Parsons was doing, all in this area, and then suddenly the entire area becomes just like a magnet for not just strange stuff, but very unsettling stuff. It's one thing to see a big black cat at Loch Ness or Loch Ness Monster, but everything out there was just connected with death. Whether it's Parsons' death, children's death, people throwing themselves off the bridge, and the fact that we're not talking about an area of 2 square miles where you could say, well, stuff just happens. No, we're talking about a concentrated little valley type area, and and nothing else. So that's probably one of the more unsettling, weird places as well. That's one that's a little bit lighter, but no less weird, which is Sedona, Arizona, where I actually got heat stroke for the first time when I moved over. I didn't realise how hot America could get, and stomping through the mountains, and didn't feel too good after an hour or so. It was like July and about 110, so I guess I should have known better, coming from rainy old England. So. But Sedona, those particular hills, the mountains there, they have a lot of rich history and folklore of so-called little people. Cultures all around the world have tales of goblins and gnomes and fairies and all that sort of thing. And when people think of fairies, you think of these sort of little, sort of female-like things with tiny wings. That imagery was only created about 150 years ago in Victorian England. Before that, they were described as more sort of like 3 foot tall, not dissimilar to the so-called greys, you know, the alien greys today, like little figures that would come out at night and break into people's homes and steal babies and things like this, which is kind of like the alien hybrid stuff we hear today. But out at Sedona, we get a lot of very similar stories. The Native Americans of that area centuries ago believed that there were these sort of magical small creatures that lived deep below the mountains in these hollowed out areas. And if you knew how to get in there, you know, there would be these ancient sort of tribes that lived deep underground that only surfaced at night because their eyes couldn't tolerate daylight and things like that. There's also been a lot of UFO activity around Sedona and a great deal of Bigfoot sightings as well. But what's interesting about the Bigfoot sightings is that, you know, a lot of people who study things like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, which collectively is called cryptozoology, you know, they take the view that these are just unknown animals that science hasn't found yet and nothing else. But a lot of the Bigfoot sightings out at Sedona, people have reported seeing these creatures and then they've kind of just vanished. You know, I mean, literally as if they'd walked through almost like an invisible doorway. And again, this has given rise to the idea of these portal type scenarios, you know, flitting in and out of reality. And could Bigfoot be kind of like one of these interdimensional beings, if you like, that sort of flits in and out of our reality, which might explain why, you know, a creature that's like 8 foot tall, why it's been so difficult for us to catch one, you know. It's like we find, I mean, people say, well, most people never see a mountain lion, but we know they're out there. Well, yeah, most people don't ever see a mountain lion in the flesh, but we do have them in zoos. They do get hit by cars. You know, we do have evidence of them. But Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Abominable Snowman, all these, they're always kind of one step ahead of us or away from us. And it's almost to the point of where it's not just good luck, you know, they'd have to be the luckiest thing on the planet. Never ever to get shot, never to get, you know, die in the woods, and just once, you know, a hunter stumble on them, you know, not asking for it to happen 100 times, because, you know, nature does take care of animals in the wild. You know, if say a deer just dies of old age in the woods, it doesn't last long because all the smaller animals eat it. You know, that's nature. But you would think just once, a 400 to 500 pound ape in a country as advanced as the United States, if there are entire tribes of them all across the country, we should get one, unless, you know, they're only here temporarily. And that's kind of borne out by the situation at Sedona, that they appear to be sort of window areas that these things come through, which, if that is true, then that might suggest they're not just apes. You know, I think it's our character as people to think that if an animal looks savage and hairy and got fangs, it's stupid. You know, what if they're highly intelligent and evolved, and, you know, they're only here part of the time, and probably with good sense, you know, I mean, who want to mix with us, you know, we probably, what would we do other than shoot it, you know, so those are the sort of things that are going on in Sedona, you know, some very different stuff, you know, bring Bigfoot into the mix. Roswell, New Mexico, and you can see that's what's one of the street lights at Roswell. Welcome to Roswell. And Roswell's weird in itself because the street lights all have these sort of black eyes, black alien eyes painted on them to make it look like an alien head. So, you know, they've really sort of embraced the story of the crashed UFO. You know, that everybody knows, you know, you don't have to be interested in UFOs. Somebody says, what's Roswell? And I say, oh, that's the UFO place, you know. And, but again, people don't realise that there's a great deal of other strange stuff going on at Roswell as well. I'm sure all of you have heard the legends, and most of them are legends, but there was one story that was verified about these so-called alligators in the sewers in New York. Well, Roswell has its own equivalent of an alligator supposedly roaming the sewers of Roswell. How an alligator got into Roswell, we're not quite sure, but it has its own story. Now there are three old buildings. One's a courthouse, one's an old theatre, and the other one's a jail, where people have reported ghostly activity. sort of strange voices. And the courthouse was actually where, just after Roswell was set up in the 19th century, it actually had hangings there. And it's been suggested it's the ghosts of the people who were hung. So the town actually has a lot of ghostly activity attached to it. There's a famous orchard in town where there's a story of this sort of legless figure that sort of glides between the orchards, between the trees. So we have those two things beyond just the UFO encounter. But there's actually a very strange story that combines the UFO issue with the ghostly activity. And when the crash of whatever it was happened in summer of 1947, bodies were supposedly recovered. They were reportedly taken to the military hospital of the old Roswell Army Airfield. Well, the military base closed down years ago, and at the same time as that, of course, the hospital did. And the hospital was eventually knocked down, and a new brick building was put in its place, which today is called the New Mexico Rehabilitation Center. It's basically, for people who've got addictions and can't get past it themselves. So it's kind of like a rehab center. But it's actually built on the foundations of the old hospital where supposedly these bodies from the Roswell crash were taken. And a number of the nurses working there have quite openly and on the record, with their names, have said they've seen these little characters sort of passing through the walls of the new building. And that's something we actually do get in a lot of ghostly stories, where ghosts seem to be tied to an area, and it's like they repetitively do the same thing over again. They might walk through a wall, and then we find that 200 years ago, it was like an old castle, there used to be a doorway there, and it got bricked up. But it's not as if they're like a living thing. It's almost like a tape loop playing over and over again, rather than like a living thing. But a lot of the nurses at the hospital have reported seeing these small figures sort of flitting through the walls late at night. And all this sort of stuff, the ghostly activity, that never really gets reported to any great extent. I think because, understandably, it gets overshadowed, by the UFO material. It's Death Valley, California, which is known for two things, or actually several things, but two I'll point out. One is so-called sailing stones. If you look at that on the right-hand side there, that's actually a stone. I don't know if you can see it there, Mark, like a line, a slight line behind it. Well, the Death Valley is home to what are called the sailing stones. And basically they're stones anywhere from like the size of that chair upwards, it's pretty big rocks and stones. And you can go out there and you can see these stones. They have like a trail behind them which goes on for miles, and they've actually moved across the desert floor. And nobody really knows how this is achieved, how they make the way across the desert. It sounds bizarre, but it's sort of joke or legend. You can go out there anytime and see them. The weird thing is nobody's actually seen them in motion. They've only seen them sort of at a standstill with this huge trail behind them. In some cases, they've actually turned around like 180 degrees and sort of gone back the other way almost. Didn't like that one, we'll try somewhere else. So, and the most down-to-earth theory is because Death Valley is so hot, but it gets a lot of sudden out-of-the-blue rain. If you imagine you've got like a really baked solid floor, and then the rain comes down and sits on it, so it's only just a slight thickness of rainwater. Well, they also get like these huge super winds that zip through the valley. One theory is, could this sort of thin veneer of rainwater, you get like a lack of friction, and it starts to slowly move the stone, and the wind gets behind it, and then because it's sailing on a slight amount of water, its own, its own power pushes it along, until it's like perhaps goes on a gradient like that, and then comes to a halt. That's not impossible. It's kind of an ingenious theory. The problem is some of these stones weigh like 200, 300 pounds, and it's been theorised that when people try to duplicate this, actually kicking, starting, moving a 200-pound stone, that's what no one's been able to achieve. They've been able to push along a small stone, like a wind turbine device behind it on a bit of water, but actually kick-starting something this high, that's sort of 300 pounds, no one's been able to achieve that. And so, it's given rise to the idea, could there be ancient energies under the ground that are somehow moving along those lines. That theory, like some sort of underground power or technology, is kind of made intriguing because a lot of rumours supposedly about the remains, if you like, of ancient civilizations deep under Death Valley. There are stories about Indiana Jones type people finding entrance points to sort of underground caverns and caves where they found sort of like Roman and Greek type architecture and archaeological structures and massive amounts of gold and jewels, and you know where to go. You can, better than winning the lottery, I guess, but some of these stories are certainly sort of folkloric, and there's no doubt about that. But it's interesting that they've surfaced, or the stories, relate to somewhere underground, and we have these tales about these stones actually being moved, possibly by something underground. Could we be looking at like an ancient technology associated with whoever these early people were? That actual photograph was taken by, that's an official US government photograph taken by like the I think it's the US Government Geological Survey it's called, and they've taken quite a deep interest in the so-called sailing stones. And if you go out there, and you pick the right spot, you can see them all over the place any time of the year. It's not even one type of part of the year when they appear, and others they don't. It's just totally at random. And a number of universities have gone out on expeditions, to try and figure out what's going on. And they've come up with all these theories, but again, they've never been able to film them actually in motion. They've just always stumbled across almost as if the technology or whatever the energy is, deliberately only moves the rocks when no one's around, which makes it even bizarrer.
Doesn't like crowds.
Yeah, doesn't like crowds. That's the Kremlin, Russia, which is basically like the Russian equivalent of the White House. And it's the home to the Russian Premier today, Vladimir Putin. Again, a lot of weird stuff at the Kremlin. Supposedly the ghosts of Lenin and Stalin, two of the more famous Russian leaders, have been seen wandering the corridors. There's also a crashed UFO story. Roswell, certainly America's most famous crashed UFO story, but reportedly the Russians have got their hands on a number of crashed UFOs over the years. And one legend suggests that at least one of these craft was taken to like a deep bunker below the Kremlin. Now, we're not able to confirm that story, but we can say for sure that these bunkers do exist. It's like most countries around the world, when the threat of nuclear war became realised, that they started building massive underground places to survive the attacks, and start over again, or at least the government would be starting over again while we left to fry, I guess, upstairs. But so the Kremlin does have these bunker type areas. They do exist, and had there been a nuclear war, from the Russians' perspective, that's where sort of their leaders and the government people would have gone, sort of 300 feet underground in steel reinforced vaults, with 3 months of water and food and whatever else. So, the potential is there for for the story to have some sort of truth to it. It's Halifax, Canada, which that actually shows the results of an explosion that occurred there in 1918, where two ships collided in the harbour. Worst case scenario, one of them actually had explosives on board, and it created almost like an atomic bomb explosion. It was one of the biggest natural, I won't say natural explosions, but disaster explosions in history. And thousands of people got killed in the town of Halifax. And ever since the explosion occurred, there have been reports of sort of ghostly encounters with some of the people who were killed in the harbour area of Halifax. But Halifax was also tied with another disaster. When the Titanic went down 6 years earlier in 1912 off Newfoundland, Halifax was the nearest big town where there were sort of ships and boats that would go out and try and help survivors, etc. But the ones they couldn't help, they brought all the bodies back to Halifax, and they're actually stored at a mortuary in town, which today is a restaurant called the Five Fishermen. And a lot of these staff and customers at the Five Fishermen have talked about seeing ghosts in the restaurants, literally dozens of them over the years. And then, of course, you realise, 100 years before, it was the town's mortuary. And so Halifax has been tied to two tragic disasters with ghostly activity attached to them, but also the harbour. Back in the mid-1800s, there was like a whole rash of sea serpent sightings, you know, kind of like the Loch Ness Monster, these long-necked creatures coming out of the water, and a lot of good quality UFO sightings over the town. Just a few years ago, the Canadian government released some of its files from the Canadian police, where they'd investigated sightings in and around the Halifax area. So this is sort of another example of another hotspot, if you like. And these are just sort of a few of the ones I touch on in the book. And I think, for me at least, you know, you can go anywhere in the world and find strange activity. But there are certain places where it's so dense and it's so many different things going on in one clearly small delineated area that I think we have to look at the place as much as we do at the phenomena that exists there. And I think, you know, however we define what a window area is, or a portal, or a paranormal doorway, I think that's what these things are. And maybe it explains why all these weird creatures like Bigfoot are so elusive. May also explain why UFOs, you know, people say, well, why are they coming from this star system to here, just to scare a few people and go home again? You know, maybe they're not. Maybe it is just the equivalent for them of, you know, jumping from one reality to another, kind of like me stepping off here down to there, literally as simple as that. And I think if we dig into this more, we might actually find a lot of the answers to whatever these things are. You know, we might be surprised to learn they actually live literally right next door to us, you know, but we don't know it for most of the time until somebody sees something weird and then it's gone again. So if anybody's got any questions about anything